Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome everybody. It's really nice. I mean, for me, this is a really special occasion because this has been a very long project for me. I think it really started in 2019, but it actually begins many, many years before, probably around 2009, when I first started to get an inkling of this part of Canadian history. And so it means a lot that you're here tonight on what is actually my last talk that I'm doing in Vancouver on this. And so I feel very privileged to have such a good crowd come out. I thought everybody had heard it and we would get a much smaller group. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey for me, and also what I learned. I've often have said that I've done a lot of history projects in my life, and every one of them is rewarding. Every one of them I learned something that I never knew before. But this particular project was transformational for me. I come out of this project a very different person than when I went in. And I feel like an indifference that I lived with for most of my life. I'm half Chinese. My mother was Chinese. Something happened to me along the way with this project. And maybe by telling you a little bit about it, you'll also see why that would have happened. I tried to position this talk as first of all, about Canadian history. And how well do we really know Canadian history? And of course, when we were growing up, many of us in this room, we learned about certain things in Canadian history that are still in our mind today. One was the fur trade and the Hudson's Bay Company. And then, of course, the battle between France and Britain that led this to be a country under the British Crown, so the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. We all know about our first prime minister and subsequent prime ministers that are on our bills. Many of us know a little bit about the two wars that we participated in, a young country, and yet we sent our boys over to help in two devastating wars. And probably all of us know a little bit about this thing called the Great Depression, which started really in 1929 and lasted 10 brutal years. That actually was a very painful episode. So we know about them in a very high level, but we're aware of them. But what's been happening probably in the last 15, 20 years is a recognition of other parts of history that are part of this book we call Canadian history, but there have been chapters missing out of that book. And these pieces now are only starting to be talked about, only starting to be researched and discovered. And in some ways, there's been a backlash against that. So some of the comments, especially that we're hearing in the US about woke culture, woke learning, there's been a backlash when communities who have traditionally been left out or traditionally even forgotten their own history start to try to understand that history, reclaim it, retell it. So it's been very fascinating to watch that happen at the same time that I've been working on this project. But I don't think you can really understand Canada unless you have a picture of all the pieces and all the missing chapters that make up this country and how it still influences us today. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this talk today. It's based on a book, but it's actually based on a very large project, which was all mostly crowdsourced from hundreds of families across Canada. And there's a reason I call it the paper trail, because you'll see as I talk about how we uncovered this story. But I'll tell you a little bit about that journey. But before I do, I want to set a little bit of context around my own philosophy and approach to history. There is something in history called people's history. And it is the belief that you cannot really understand history unless you understand it and from the point of view of an ordinary person. So when we talk about the Great Depression, for example, we know that it was terrible for people and there were long soup lines and unemployment, but you really only feel that history when you actually hear the story of someone's life and their experience of that. So there's a belief that true history is the one that ordinary people create through their everyday struggles. And I believe that firmly, and I've come to believe that because of the work that I've done with interviewing the community over the years. The second thing is, this is a fellow named Studs Terkel. He was a journalist and a historian in the United States. He wrote several books, but two in particular. One was about the Great Depression, and the second one was about the Second World War. But rather than doing this big arc of a story, he took it down and he interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people about their experience of living through the Depression, the experience of being in war, whether you were over in Europe or whether you were back home working in the factories or you were waiting for news about what happened to your son in Europe. So he told the story that way. But what I really loved was this quote that he has in the book Hard Times, which was about the Great Depression. And he says, "This has been true for all disasters. The great many were wounded in one manner or another. It left on them an invisible scar." And I discovered how true that was when I began to delve into this story. So most of my work I have done as a community historian is a bit about memory. I'm interested in people's memory. I'm interested in photographs that evoke memories. So that has been the focus of my work, understanding the lived experience of history. I don't really care about the dates and things like that. I care about what it was like to live through something. So how I discovered this story was quite by accident. My first journey coming back into my community was to interview Second World War veterans. And I wanted to understand the experience of being in war and what it was like to be there, what it was like to come back. I wanted them to share their memories with me. And what was interesting is, as they began to do that, one of the things I would ask is, first of all, where were you born? Start always with the easy questions. And the second thing I would ask is, can you show me some of your photographs, like when you were a kid or during the war? What can we look at? And they would go in and pull out their shoe boxes and Zeller's bags and just bring out things that I could look at. And for many of those veterans, I kept seeing this card. And I was surprised when I saw it at first. I thought, well, that's interesting. Like, he was a little older here in the Department of Immigration, and they were all dated close to the same time. But none of these men, except for one, ever explained to me what this was all about. They just said, oh, well, that's just something the government gave us. But as I was finishing up another project on a photographer called Yucho Chow, whose family is here today, I was thinking about all these images that I had seen, and I thought, well, I know that these cards exist, and I was fascinated by the photographs. I wanted to do another photographic exhibition. And so I thought, well, I know the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act is coming in 2023. Nobody was talking about it, not even all these people that I've interviewed over all these years. So I thought, maybe I'll do an exhibition on that, and I'll take all these cards that I found, I'll take the photographs, and I'll do a photographic exhibition. I'll call it Photographs or Portraits of Exclusion. So that began this hunt that I started to do across Canada And I was asking people for, these are called CI certificates. CI means Chinese immigration certificates. So they were certificates only issued to Chinese. Most of them have a photograph on them, which makes them really compelling. And I actually learned through this process that the first mass use of photo identification in Canada was for the Chinese. And then I learned that the reason why it started in 1912, that they began to have photographs of all Chinese, is that in 1910, the government introduced mugshots in Kingston Penitentiary. And they so liked them and so thought they were good at helping you distinguish one person from another that they said, well, the next group we're going to apply this to are Chinese. And it's a commentary in many ways about surveillance and control, but on the other hand, it also leaves us with photographs that make these documents come alive. Suddenly we're looking at somebody. But all these documents, these CI certificates, were all given out by the government. New ones were created. They're all color-coded, serial number. They have different names. And I knew that about 86,000 were actually issued individually. One copy, I give it to you. If you lose this, God help you. But there's only one copy ever made. And I knew that they were rare, because in all the interviews I did, there were so few of these left. So I thought, well, the gift I can do for the community is I can find these, scan them, create an archive so that future generations could find them. And I would collect the story of the person who owned it. And specifically, I would ask what the family today knew about what that person went through during the period of exclusion, which was 1923 to 1947. And I'll talk a little bit more about exclusion in a moment. I was fascinated by what I got. Like, some of these were obviously well-worn. This is, taped together with masking tape. But something happened as I began to collect these. So I'm collecting these from the direct descendants of the people who went through this dark period of exclusion. And when I would ask them, tell me something about what you know or what you heard about what this person went through. And overwhelmingly, it was silence. In fact, people would say to me, is that the same thing as the head tax? Or, we were just about to throw this away. And what do you mean? Like, no, we never heard anything. My dad never talked about it. My grandfather never talked about it. Sometimes, I would get a little squeak of a memory where a woman would say, no, my mom never talked about it. But I do remember. She never let us wear braids. She forbid us to wear braids. And now, as an older woman telling me this, she realizes because the braids looked like the early cues that Chinese would wear when they first came over. So you get these little tiny breadcrumbs of memories that people would give you. But overall, here I am doing a project on memory, and there's basically no memory. Even though I'm talking to the descendants they're talking about their fathers, their grandfathers. It's not that far away. So that ended up creating a whole different kind of project. I realized I couldn't just do a photography project. That really I needed to if not on the 100th anniversary of this particular law, then when would we do it? That we would actually go in and delve into this story. And fortunately, I have a good friendship with Dr. Henry Yu of UBC History. And I approached him and I said, I need some help. I need some people, because I can't do this all on my own in the time frame we have. And he gave me a small posse of students, history students, which were so enthusiastic. And we began this deep excavation of this story. So we call it the paper trail because it was not just those papers that you saw, most of them having been destroyed, the CI certificates, because people were so ashamed of them because they represented something so evil, but also we went through all the Chinese newspapers, one issue at a time between roughly 1922 to 1947, went through the English newspapers in all the major cities and minor cities, and you'll see some of these stories come up. We went into trial records, into coroner's reports. We went into some of the clan societies here that have scrapbooks and took a look at their scrapbooks, looked at letters that had been sent to them from different people as they lived through this period of time. We had pushed the government to release all the Exclusion Act records, which they had held under privacy laws for almost 100 years. No one had seen them. And we said, in the interest of reconciliation, it's time to release all the documents that were created for the Exclusion Act. Every one of them had a photo on them. So this becomes really rich, a lot of texture to this. And all those different paper trails together helped to create the story you're about to hear. And what was interesting for me was that I thought it couldn't have been that bad, the Exclusion Act, because nobody's ever really talked to me about it. Even all the older people I had interviewed who had lived through it, only one ever mentioned it. So I thought it couldn't have been that bad. And what I discovered was it was that bad. And that's why the silence. That's why within a generation, the story was not passed on from one generation to the next. It was just, nobody wanted to talk about it. So I need to do a little bit of background with you, though, for those of you who are less familiar with this, but I'm going to go through this section quickly because I really want to get to the lived experience of exclusion. So basically, one thing you should know is that exclusion actually began with the first head tax. That was an exclusionary policy. It was designed to encourage the men who built the Chinese who built the railroad to leave, and certainly we don't want them to be bringing their wives and children here. So that's actually the first form of exclusion. And they increase it, the head tax, and they increase it again, and Chinese are still coming. So finally, the desperate act in 1923 is to actually bar Chinese completely. But this is a newspaper headline from November 1922. This is the actual newspaper. Must bar Oriental completely to save BC for the white race. But you'll notice in the third paragraph down, it says total exclusion of Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, and all other Asiatics was the wish of the Honorable William Sloane. He was from BC. So initially in November 1922, the government wants to scoop up all Asians in this exclusion law. But in the end, when the law is actually written, it's only Chinese that are singled out. And there's this sense of why us again? We're the only community to have ever been inflicted with the head tax. And now we're singled out again for total exclusion. And what's interesting too, for me, is that I learned this, is that it's BC that actually is the province that is the biggest advocate for both the head tax and exclusion. So BC was like, the deep south or the Mississippi of Canada. All the worst, and I'll actually use the word racism, was here, not just against Chinese, but also against South Asians and Japanese, of course, but the worst was in this province and Indigenous people. So that was interesting to see in all these newspaper clippings, how much the BC government is the one leading the charge on these things. So these are an example of some of the newspaper headlines people are beginning to see. So this is February 1923. So this is before the Exclusion Act comes in now. It comes in Canada Day, Dominion Day, July 1st, 1923. So this is the lead up. And the Chinese community is reading these kind of newspaper headlines. Chinese immigrants in Canada to be registered and fingerprinted. And again, the reaction is, But fingerprints are only used for criminals. They're only used in the penal system. So why is it that we have to be fingerprinted? So they're basically, over the course of 2 years, the community enters a fight. So there's obviously a lot of people that don't want to put up with this. And the first fight they have is against exclusion, which is what's in the law. And they meet actually in Victoria at one point in time. They come from all over, and then they go over to Ottawa to the Senate. And of course, traveling back then was really difficult. And they start to lobby the Senate, because as we know in our system, it's the Senate that kind of has the last say on pieces of legislation going through. But this is from May 16th, 1923. So the Chinese delegation shows up and gives the senators a report on what they should change and why they shouldn't go through with this. And then each member of the upper chamber has received a copy of the voluminous petition on behalf of the Chinese Association of Canada. It is a document of 18 foolscap pages and is so voluminous that the majority of the recipients discarded it without perusal. I can imagine how soul-crushing that felt to just be ignored. Now, in the end, the Senate does make some tweaks to the law, but basically the law comes in. So July 1st, 1923, they chose Canada Day, Dominion Day purposely to bring in the law. The law is called the Chinese Immigration Act 1923, but we know it as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Back then, Chinese called it the Cruelty Act and talked about how humiliating it was. So the next big important date is June 30th, 1924, so a year later. So the act, the actual implementation of the act says every Chinese person has 1 year to register. You got to show up at an immigration office or an RCMP detachment in many places, and you're going to have to answer a barrage of questions. You have to show who you are. You got to bring in 3 photos of yourself, and we'll decide if you can stay or not. And you have to do this, otherwise you risk a fine or jail or deportation. But interestingly, it also applies to every child born in Canada. So it's no longer just about immigration. So that registration, another fight starts after the Exclusion Act goes in. The next fight is about the registration. And so again, the community is reading these kind of stories, RCMP to round up Chinese for registration and photos. And again, you can just put yourself in that place and reading these kinds of things, and how would that make you feel? What kind of fear? And in fact, we learned through the paper trail that it's actually the registration that most puts the fear of God into the community. They worry about what's going to happen if I don't remember things the way the government's recorded them. What if my business failed? I came in as a merchant, I never paid the head tax, my business fails, and now I have to report that I'm a failure. What are they going to do to me? So we find a lot of articles on how the Chinese were bitter about the registration. Again, they felt like they were being criminals, especially having to go to the RCMP. They file more protests. Some of them say, we're not. There's a few of us that aren't going to bother to register, and let's see you in court. Because we've been here a long time. Let's see you try to challenge a Canadian-born on this. But in the end, as the deadline of June 30th, 1924 approaches, most people register. There's some that don't, and in the book, we actually look at some of those who just magically disappear. And when I did a project on Yu Cho Chow, I kept on noticing how many photos were done in 1924. This is a whole separate project, much earlier. And I couldn't, I didn't know why, how many family photos were done in 1924. But now I realize that was because people were getting their photographs taken just before the deadline. And then these photographs get applied to these cards. So again, the really important thing about this card, this is a Canadian-born child. His father's Canadian-born. It's from the Department of Immigration and Colonization. And on the bottom is this line, very powerful phrase. This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. A way to symbolically transfer exclusion to a new generation born here. We also, in the book, take a look at some of the people that registered. This is really interesting. The first guy to register went by the name of Harry Hamilton from Ottawa. He obviously was trying very much to integrate. This is a certificate of a guy who gets arrested. He actually gets thrown in jail because he came in as a merchant and so never paid the head tax. And then he shows up and he has to confess, now I'm just working as a cook. My business failed. So they $500 right now. He only has 50, so they throw him in jail. And here, lastly, this child is white. This is actually a chow out of Moose Jaw. But a Chinese father adopts him, so even he has to register. So at the end of that registration, this is what's going to come out later on, it said we discovered that there were 48,426 adult males. The majority of these men are married, but they're on their own here in Canada. Only 1,350 adult females in all of the country. And most of them are married to one of those 48,000 males, and children under 18, 6,204, not all of them Canadian-born, just under 18. And this law was in place for almost a quarter century. Through the Great Depression, through the stock market falls, through Japan invading China, through the beginning of the Second World War, through the first flight across the Atlantic. All these things were happening. So that's just a bit of the background. But what I really wanted to do in this book was to really focus on the experience of exclusion. What was the lived reality for people as told through individual stories. And really, we discovered things broke into two. And in the book the first group we look at is those who were defeated by this act, who started to become unmoored, who fell into despair. And what's sad is that most of these men never left any descendants. So the only way we could find them was sometimes a little newspaper story about somebody, and then we'd follow their paper trail. Or we heard a rumor about somebody, and we would try to find out who they were. Some of these men just left. And this is three notices in the newspaper of three men in December of 1923. So this is during that 1 year I'm going to focus on. And they decide to leave. And it's really beautiful the way they write some of their goodbye notes. Like, I have lived overseas for several decades, rootless and drifting. Now I'm almost 70 years old, struggling with sickness, poverty, hunger, and homelessness. My heartfelt thanks to all the relatives and friends for funding my journey. Some of them said things like, I don't want to die a ghost in a foreign land. Others talked about never feeling like they belonged. And it's really powerful. So they're leaving. They're all now old men leaving Canada because this act now has extinguished all hope. But there are some for whom this period was even more devastating. And we started to find these men who really just came apart. And this is a fellow named Tai Hing Gom. I don't know how many of you went to the exhibition, but we talk about him, and he is just shortly after the Exclusion Act comes in, 13 days later, so July 13th. He's been here, and this is what was interesting. These men that come up apart have actually been here 20, 30 years in Canada. And somehow they manage, usually they're all laborers. They're kind of like at the low end of the wage spectrum. They go through periods where they're barely eking out a living, living basically in poverty, living with all this hatred around them, living like completely separated, unable to even afford a trip home. And yet they keep going. But it's this act that finally brings them to their knees. And we find him winding up, coming apart, and being picked up by the police and hospitalized and put into Essendale, where he stays for the next 16 years. We have this other story, again, from Lethbridge, where this fellow here, Ling Wo, he winds up having a little dry goods store where he sells silk. And just around the same time that all this is happening, he opens the store just before the Exclusion Act comes in, and then he does some advertising, so he's obviously hopeful. And then the act, full force of the act comes in, and he just comes apart, and he throws open the doors to his silk goods stores and says, "Take whatever you want." And of course, pandemonium comes, and there's people are ransacking the place, and the police show up, and they think, oh, he must be on drugs or alcohol, and they take him down to the station. But basically, he's had a mental health crisis, and yet he had been in Canada for quite a while. And so we only found this story in the newspaper, and then we eventually found his registration, the Exclusion Act registration, which finds that he's in the Alberta Mental Hospital in Ponoco. And there he remains for a couple of years. And lastly, these were the ones that really affected me, was we began to find, again in that 1 year, so many stories of men who took their lives. And again, many of them had been here for so long. This guy had been here almost 40 years. And it's this act, again, that just leads to this utter despair. And he takes his life. But he's one of many newspaper headlines or newspaper stories that we found, mostly in BC, but in other parts of the country, of these men who commit suicide. And it's interesting, when they do find a little note somewhere on them, that expression, tired of life, comes up a few times. So again, these men have no one to remember they even existed. And it's because of this paper trail, in many ways, that it's a blessing that we can find them, find their photos, see who they were, retell their stories, and remember that they paid the greatest price for this. But most of the book is happy, and there's over 80 stories in this book, and most of them are not so much happy, but they're about survivors, people who made it through. And we often use the phrase plum blossoms, because in Chinese culture, the plum blossom is the one flower that blooms the earliest and survives the harshest cold of winter and all the changes that are thrown at it. And so we call the survivors the plum blossoms. And these are people who found a way to get through this. In the book, we look at marriages. We look at like a few of those men that are actually married and are really, raising families in China, seeing their kids maybe only once every 10 years, really being strangers to their children. We look at mixed race marriages and what happened in the few cases where that happened. We came across newspaper headlines that says clergy refuses to marry white woman to Chinese man. In this case, they did get together, but she paid a very high price. She was ostracized by the white community, thinking there's something wrong with her, that she would be with a Chinese man. And recently there was a documentary done out of Toronto where a woman actually gets jailed, a white woman, for having a relationship with a Chinese man. We have women who are forced to change nationality, Canadian-born, but then losing whatever status you have when you marry someone who's an immigrant. We found several stories on this, actually, of since women were so rare, especially young women coming up who are going to be mature soon. There's a lot of cases where fathers are trying to marry these daughters off to men who are now stuck here. So they're men who were born in China but have no hopes of having their wives over. So these young girls become very precious, very coveted. And this is a really powerful story that even made the headlines of a young woman who wants out of that arranged marriage. Some of the stories look at family tragedy. We look at this appeared in the book. I'm not too sure what happened there. Sorry about that. And it's a story of these families are so rare in this case that when something happens to one parent, it can be close to catastrophic for the family. So in this case, this is one of the stories we look at of a man who ran a hand laundry. And in 1924, not only does the Exclusion Act come in, he loses his wife, has no prospect of finding another wife in Canada, cannot bring one over from China, and therefore is forced to give his children up for adoption. We also look at stories of women who wind up losing their husbands, coming all the way over from China, and then their husbands die, and they wind up becoming the sole breadwinner. And it's even more difficult for them because they're women and they're Chinese, and yet they still have to continue to move forward with their families. We also look at a story of how deaths can also affect the children in the family. So in this case, Quan Yuan Yen, whose granddaughter is here, he's a Victoria businessman who is murdered, actually. He's assaulted in his place of business and dies. And it has a profound effect on his family. His wife doesn't speak English. And so a lot of the responsibility of the family is placed on the oldest daughter, the one that you see holding the bike there, Louise. And so she has to step up at 14 and become an adult. And what was interesting about her story was that her daughter told me that Louise never, ever talked about what had happened to her father and the impact it had had on her life. Like she even went silent about that. And so it's been interesting for us to uncover some of the story of what happened when he was murdered. It was a huge thing in Victoria at the time. And the other one is this is from the Chow family, actually, of a story of what happens when both parents die. And how it's a rarity, but it can happen. And in this case, Mabel Chow, who was actually Yu Cho Chow's daughter, and Dick Jong-eng, both died. They died within 3 years of each other. They had 9 children. And it was actually the oldest one there you see on the far back right. She turned 18, and she had to take over looking after all the family. And interestingly, they told me that it was those Chinese men, what we call bachelor men, the ones who are married but actually don't have family here, that it was those men that came to their rescue. That some of the old men one of them worked on a ferry, and he worked in the kitchen in the ferry, so he would bring scraps of food. Another one took the kids around to the gambling houses in Chinatown and said, these are Dick Eng's orphans and they need money, and so the gamblers would give money. And they managed to sustain themselves. But again, families are so rare, so when something happens, the whole world can fall apart. But it was because of these bachelor men that they actually survived, this family. And then we have another story of what happens when a family, so they've got everything, they've got they have a legacy, they have 10 kids, and everything looks great. And then you lose half of them within a very short period of time, all to TB at that time. And so in the end, and even the wife dies, probably out of just despair and heartbreak over losing so many of her children. But ironically, those children all had that immigration card, even though they were born in Canada, and 4 of them went on to serve Canada in the Second World War, despite having that card. We also look at stories of rejection and racism. And sometimes racism, we discovered, was very subtle. So for example, Ji Chan Hao, he was living in Moose Jaw, and the only thing he ever told his grandkids was there was a time in Moose Jaw when all the white people wore this badge and it said, purely English. And he said, how we felt like it was directed at us, like, because we're here, and everyone's wearing a purely English badge. Sometimes it was subtle in this story out of Vancouver, this woman, Su Hoon Dang, she was a mother, her husband ran a tailor shop. She was a very shy woman, and she had a number of children, but she would go to Woodward's, and she would stand in line, and when her son told me the story, it was the only time in the whole interview he began to weep. And he said, I remember being with my mom and holding her hand, and the clerks would ignore her. They would serve everybody else, and my mom would just be standing there. She had no confidence to say anything, and even if she did, it probably would have made things worse. And he said, we were always the last ones to be served. It had to be empty before she was served. So, not like overt racism, but just more subtle in some ways. To those stories of Chinese who were forced in BC to sit at the back of the bus, the back of movie theaters. But sometimes that racism actually had even a more profound effect on your life. So Bill and Jack Wong, some of you will know them, who ran Modernized Tailors. Both of them went to university and got an engineering degree, and yet were refused work, like in any place they would go to because they were Chinese. In many ways, they still made a great contribution. They ran Modernized Tailors. They sewed. They had all the original patterns and sewed for many movie sets and actors. But it meant nothing to have a degree. And sometimes racism could bring in your death. So Yi Nin Fun was in Glishan, Alberta. He worked in a little cafe in that little town. That town is right next to the Blackfoot Nation, Siksika, I think they call it. And but he would serve Indigenous people who would sometimes stop in at the cafe. And he told his family the story about how he became really deathly ill, but no white doctor in the town would treat him. So it was actually the Indigenous community that took him back to the reserve and nursed him back to health. And he learned to speak their language fluently. And his granddaughter said, I remember he would never, ever, ever let us say anything negative about an Indigenous person because of what they had done to save his life. There's Glishan, Alberta. So we also look at stories of poverty in the Great Depression. Even people working in restaurants, not having enough to eat. This is a funny story in that Choi Lee actually volunteers at a restaurant. He says, I'll work for free, but just give me a meal, and they wind up firing him because they feel he ate too much. This is a woman out of Saskatchewan who wound up family didn't know it at the time, killing a skunk during the Depression and skinning it, missing the scent glands, and feeding it to her family, because again, there were no supports for Chinese. This is a fellow who lost everything. He had had a big ranch near Merritt, big family, and lost everything in the Depression like so many people did. And we also look at many stories of people who adapted. This is a story out of Owen Sound, Dan Lee, who desperately wanted to fit in. In Owen Sound, he would have stood out like a sore thumb, and so he began to learn how to do fishing and ice fishing and pulling maple syrup and learning English at a time when there was actually no classes. He taught himself English just to try to fit in. To this family, which is the Kong family, who wound up, when their restaurant in Saskatchewan wasn't enough to keep them fed, they decided to take some of their children and turn them into circus performers to make a little extra money. So the Kong acrobats became famous, actually, and wound up traveling all over North America. And we also look at stories of those who fought back. One of the descendants of this man, Quan Wing Gao, is in the audience tonight. And this is a fellow who ran a produce store in Vancouver. But two of his cousins were killed in road accidents. These were early road accidents in trucks. But the second death was because of a young white kid who was really speeding and hit the truck and killed his cousin. And I guess this kid got charged twice, got off twice. And Quan Wing Gao realized that for the family back in China who had been relying on this fellow's money, like that wasn't good enough, damn it. And he wound up suing this white boy, young man. Something was very, very rare to do at that time. And he was successful, though. He did get money that was sent back to sustain the family in China. This is a great story. I won't get into it here, but it's a fellow, the potato baron. He ran a big farm on Lulu Island, and he was constantly being challenged by white farmers. And but you read the story about how clever he is to get around things. He just wouldn't put up with much. And lastly, this is an interesting fellow that we met through the Wong Clan Association. His name was Wong Jim Goon. And he was actually, and this is actually what he was called, was the king of thugs. He was a real bad guy, like an enforcer who would beat people up, and he was involved in drugs and in prostitution rings and all this kind of stuff, and murders, charged many times. But what's really interesting is that around 1923, when the Act comes in, this fellow completely has a turnaround, has an epiphany. And he was very, very smart, first of all, but just, an enforcer. Anyway, he wound up completely changing, having a kind of a road to Damascus moment. And he ended up helping to found the Wong Clan Association and to found the Wong Mongqiang School, which is the school that they have where they teach culture. It was one of the first schools to be created in Chinatown. So this is what ends the chapter on the survivors. And we found this article, and I think it says a lot. So we're coming now to the end of the exclusion period. For many Chinese in Canada, the long years of separation, longing, worrying, and waiting finally came to an end in 1946. The Second World War was over. Travel between North America and China had been restored. The Exclusion Act had not yet been repealed. In early December 1946, newspaper stories in both the English and Chinese media reported that hundreds of Chinese men from across the country were making the journey back to China. Some were only going for a visit. Others were going home to live out their final years of life. 3 men never made it. They died waiting, with all their worldly possessions packed, their voyage delayed due to a maritime strike in the US. Canadian historian and author Pierre Burton was at the train station in Vancouver to witness the exodus. He spoke to some of the travelers and described what he'd heard. Quote, "Many of the older ones will not return. They are too old to work, too sick in many cases to care. Their life in Canada without a family has been a lonely one, thwarted by an 8-year war from making the trip they desired long ago. Their only wish now is to get back to the country of their birth." The elderly men returning that day were like plum blossoms, the only flower able to survive the harsh cold of winter. Like that winter flower, they had made it through the most miserable of times. Standing in their weary queues, grasping their few belongings, harboring their memories and hopes, they had endured the long, dark winter of exclusion. They had survived. So the real change that happens in this story is chapter 4, which is about the war. And it's interesting that something so devastating as a war, 60 million dead worldwide, the worst war in human history, is what begins the change for the Chinese Canadian community. So much of this is about how Chinese Canadian men and women, many of them holding those immigration cards that said they did not have status in Canada, were eager to enlist and to volunteer to serve Canada. We look at a number of different stories of what people did, what they did in the factories, what they did in different parts of the world. Some of them actually left for the US, thinking they'd have better luck down there. For some, when the war was done, some of the men that were in Southeast Asia wound up having to, the Canadian government didn't pay for their way home, didn't send troop ships to bring them home. They actually had to wind up working on cargo ships, and in this case, like cleaning and painting and cooking in order to make it home to Canada. And in some cases, we have families that were more than like the Cobongs and in this case, the Louis families. This is the H.Y. Louis family that owns London Drugs and IGA, that they actually send 2 boys out. One doesn't come home and the other one does. And we have some of their descendants here today. The start of the Second World War in 1939 would sow the first seeds of change for Chinese in Canada. For some Chinese Canadian families, the war would bring unbearable heartache and loss. We know of at least 9 young Canadian-born Chinese men, all in their early 20s and at the beginning of their life's journey, who would never live to celebrate the end of the war. They would never hold a citizenship certificate or witness the end of exclusion, nor would they know how much their sacrifice would change the lives of generations of Chinese Canadians who would come after them. For their immigrant parents, losing a child to a country that had so discriminated against and vilified their community likely made the loss feel even greater and the wound deeper. Added to their pain was the realization that their children's bodies would never be returned to Canada. These grieving mothers and fathers would never have the opportunity or the means to visit their sons' graves in Europe. At the end of the Second World War, the Chinese community could proudly look back, knowing they had done their part for Canada. The community had purchased large numbers of victory bonds to support the war effort. They had helped build the aircraft and the ships and helped make the ammunition needed for the battlefront. They had recycled their metals and rubbers. They had patrolled neighborhoods, stood on watch over sea lanes, and been ready in the event of an invasion. Most importantly, their sons and daughters had served the country with distinction. For a brief period, Chinese Canadians felt accepted, wanted, and valued. And for Alex Louis, who served in the Canadian Army, becoming a soldier was transformational. When he put on the soldier's uniform for the first time, he felt like a free man. Before that, he told me, this is his daughter, he woke up every day like someone was physically kneeling on his chest, like a crushed person who couldn't dream of being free. I think that is so revealing of what it felt like under exclusion, that he would tell his daughter that. The successful fight against tyranny and racism on the battlefields of Europe and Asia was both empowering and radicalizing for the Chinese Canadians who served overseas. However, when these soldiers returned to Canada, once again, they returned to being second-class citizens. Nothing had changed at home. Most Chinese Canadians still could not vote. Chinese still remain barred from countless career opportunities and robbed of citizenship rights and having a voice in their own country. Consequently, the end of the war was the beginning of two new battles for Chinese Canadians: the fight to obtain equal rights and the fight to repeal the hated Exclusion Act. Okay, so I'm going to have to go a little faster here, and this always happens to me. The next chapter is really about the fight for repeal. But more than that, it's about, even once it's over, like how the ashes of exclusion carried on, how the remnants of exclusion, the aftermath of it, carried on for decades. And the first is in what we call the forever bachelors. These were the hundreds of elderly men who lived out the rest of their lives here in Canada, many of whom were never able to reunite with their families, who were never able to bring them over. Again, what most of these men have in common is that they were laborers, so they were at the bottom of the pecking order in terms of what they had. They had spent their entire lives toiling in low-wage and often seasonal jobs. And we learned that some of these men were too ashamed to return to their families as poor and destitute men with little to show for their years in Canada. Others had spent so much of their lives away from China, 30, 40, 50 years, that they now felt like foreigners when they went back. They were strangers to their kids. They didn't belong. This place had become a form of home. So maybe many of these men grew old, and I knew them. Some of you remember these in your life. They grew old and took their last breaths on Canadian soil. And I remember them. I remember seeing them in Chinatown a lot. And one of the things that did happen with some of these men is that they became uncles, what we call uncles, to someone else's children, and created wonderful memories for someone else's children. They became like a form of caregiver. And so we interviewed a number of people who could tell us stories about these men. And it's a wonderful, one of my favorite chapters in here are these photographs and memories of people telling me about these men. And interesting, it usually centers around food, things that you don't get at home that the bachelor will give you. This is our filmmaker's bachelor who used to work in Union Laundry with him and roll him around in the big washing machines to get the coins, of course with the electricity unplugged. And they come from all over Canada. And interestingly, often the men's names aren't even known. They were just known as uncle, like Suk or Bak, and nothing else about them. So, but at one time in Chinatown, they accommodated these men. Some of the restaurants, like all of a sudden I'm blanking out here, Gord. BC Royal and the other one, Hong Kong Cafe, yeah, were filled with these stools because they were catering to all these men, 39 stools. But I also realized what we discovered is that not only were all these men left behind whose lives never got going, who never kind of, or have family, even though they have family, but we also realized that even those who had a chance to be reunited struggled. When you've spent most of your lives apart, it's hard to suddenly find yourself together. So we look at some stories like of a woman, that young girl there, she's still alive, Grace, who when she meets her father, that's him on the far left. He's such an old man and he's frail. And he's unable to do anything with her. Like he's not well enough. He's waited all that time from the time he got here in his 20s. And that just shows you the difference between when he came and near the end of his life. All that lifetime by himself here, just sending money back home. We also heard of how when families did reunite, often a young son or daughter could not bring themselves to say the word father to their parent, even though he'd been here all this time. This one fellow, the guy standing up there, Matthew, told me this, and again, he starts to weep because he realizes all those years his father worked and kept the family going, and he couldn't bring himself when he finally met his father here to call him father. And he feels this great lament and guilt that, all those years made it impossible for them to really bond. I can't do these ones, so I'm just going to keep going. Sorry. This is a story of a fellow 50 years living here. And finally, after the end of the union, he applies to be a Canadian citizen. He sponsors his wife, and then there's a delay. And she arrives in March, and he dies in April. The greatest of tragedies, but at least he got her here. And we end this chapter by looking at the issue of redress. And some of you will know about this when the head tax and Prime Minister Harper at the time made an apology for the head tax. But when it came, the government's apology focused heavily on the Chinese head tax. There was little mention of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and yet in the quarter century it was in effect. Yet it was the Exclusion Act that caused the most suffering. No amount of money could properly compensate for the human cost it exacted. And interesting, of all those 86,000 head taxpayers, in the end, only 800 were able to claim the compensation. And of those, only 20 were the original head taxpayers. Talk about bad timing. So part of the book looks at what we did 100 years later, because I could only find newspaper articles on what happened 100 years ago. But no images, no artifacts. We wanted to ensure that this time we recorded what we did, so we looked at all the things we did across Canada. And sorry, I'm just going to quickly finish with this. I'm behind schedule. This is going back to the notion of silence. And we end the book with this. Remembrance. Remembrance requires something to remember. But what if we don't know what we should remember? What happens when silence extinguishes memory? The paper trail has taught us that silence speaks volumes, and out of silence can emerge whispers from the past. We need only listen. Through this 100th anniversary commemoration, we learned how early Chinese Canadians buried the pain and humiliation of the exclusion years by staying silent. The consequence was that within a single generation, memory was lost, and a monumental chapter in the history of one community had all but disappeared. For me and the hundreds of other descendants of early Chinese Canadians, unearthing these buried voices has been deeply rewarding and emotional, and has fundamentally changed who we are and how we connect to our past. The process of discovery has led us to feel both great empathy for those who went before us and a sense of debt and gratitude to them. We also discovered that the very documents our community once despised can hold new meaning for us today. The silver lining to the government-issued CI certificates, all those thousand certificates for surveillance, is that today they are the remnants that help us fill the void left by silence. In the absence of having our stories passed on directly, these fragile pieces of paper provide a glimpse and a profile of our past. The mugshot portraits attached to those certificates have left many of us with the only photographic record of some ancestors. Ironically, the paper trail of CI certificates has humanized our history, provided faces to names, and unlocked stories. Unfortunately, Canada's past cannot be changed. Only our present and our future can be shaped by the lessons we glean from the mistakes we made as a country and as a community. After all we have learned, we must not go back to being silent. It is now the duty of a new generation to pass on to future generations all that we have discovered and felt and remembered. Thank you.